Hello, welcome to Movie Uppers. My name is Bob Sham.
I'm Angela.
The sounds here may be dogs, and this month we're nearing the end. One of our last two we've got to discuss for this month's Glory and Propaganda, war movies that take place during wartime. They have a variety of tones, some a little more jingoistic than others, and a lot of anti-war films. I'd say roughly half of what we've discussed are considered anti-war films, and this would be in that category as well. It's an interesting thing to touch base on this movie, which takes place during the Lebanese War. The country of Israel attacked Lebanon and invaded Lebanon after an assassination attempt in London of a Israeli diplomat. They didn't get the guy, but it was just enough, the final straw that would push Israel to enter into Lebanon and push deeper into Beirut, where the event that we're discussing here occurs. Much like in Casualties of War, it's about a specific event that occurred within a major conflict. This movie got tons of critical praise when it came out, and to its credit, it does utilize a language that calls the situation what it is in terms of what occurred here, even though everyone we're talking to in this movie is a member of the Israeli army, the IDF. The young lead, Ari Folman, this is a quasi-documentary, doesn't seem very sympathetic to Israel. But one thing that is completely lacking is any view or perspective of the things that a lot of this shit actually happened to. We just see all through their eyes. And I kind of understand that, because if they are to try to represent the Palestinian side of this issue, then maybe that could make it worse. Maybe even seem a little... Remember that show Girls? A tentative connection here. She was criticized a lot for not having women of color on the show.
Or people of color.
But the show is about spoiled white girls.
Yeah. And her answer to that was to fuck Donald Glover at the beginning of season 2.
WALTZ with Bashir, they don't know what it's like to be a Palestinian. They can't even contend with their own Israeliness in the face of it all. And then you got what's going on now with Gaza, which is in response to attacks on October 7th, which surprised everyone, including the IDF. But now we've had this intense response in which tens of thousands, and Lancet estimates clear over 100,000 dead in Gaza. We'll get more into that as we go into it. It's impossible, if you're understanding this situation now, how to remove it, like how to contend with it here, because this movie is very bold. It even has the main characters, Israeli, admitting to genocidal type actions, or at least being complicit in it. But we're talking about the movie WALTZ with Bashir from 2008, directed by Ari Folman, written by Ari Folman, starring Ari Folman. It's like a quasi-documentary, but it's animated. The style of it is pretty unique, especially for its time. But think of it more like the Waking Life and Scanner Darkly kind of thing.
The opening scene, it's a dream sequence, and there are a bunch of dogs running through the city. The first impression of the animation to me, it felt as though... And I know this is going to sound, I don't know how this is going to sound, but to me, it was as if they took the comic book and made it move. It wasn't like they animated it. There was like a extra layer to it almost.
Sure. There was a point where there were these things called motion comics, and I think there's a little more movement in here, but it was similar to that kind of thing where they just have these, almost like these, what you call it, they're better than Flash animations, but something like that, in which the images, panels of a comic story, and you'll have a comic character like lift their arm up and do this, something like that.
It did make me think of that kind of animation, for sure.
And the style, I think, lends it a bit to the war aspect of it. It does go well together. It's a very unique looking movie, and I think in terms of pure visual, it does execute.
It's so interesting to me that it is a documentary style film, because you get the standard documentary style talking head interviews of people. You get introductions. They actually post their names on the screen. The reason it works so well is because they can so seamlessly go from an older gentleman talking about his memories to his memories. The perspective this is coming from is, I was in this army. I know things happened, but I can't remember them. And so Ari is on this mission to figure out what he did.
It's a framing device, a story device. Ari Folman, I don't think, literally forgot what he had witnessed in the 1982 Lebanese War.
For sure, but it's reminiscent of the idea that if there's a super traumatic event, you might repress that. Mm-hmm. If you don't want to remember it, you can push it away.
He realizes something is missing. Like, he knows he was served in this conflict. He was about 19 years old. He's talking to other people because he's a filmmaker and he's trying to gather stories. And when he talks to an old guy that he was in the military with, he tells a story of how this regiment he was in during that time, they knew he couldn't shoot people, so they had him shoot dogs so that dogs wouldn't alert as they were rolling through this city in Lebanon. And so he talks about the trauma of that and how that kind of fucks him up, and how he has these dreams with dogs. And it's through that where he realizes, and the guy tells him, like, yeah, you were there. And he's like, what? Like, he doesn't remember. And so the rest of the movie is framing, is it inches closer and closer to why he's forgotten it. It goes to different people within his regiment and stories that they're telling of what happened during this time. And apparently a lot of these stories are true, that these men did experience these kind of things when they were in the military. And a lot of the people, all but two people that he interviews, are the voices of the people who were in the situation.
I noticed that at the end, that there were two folks who were dubbed.
Yeah, they were dubbed, and they asked that their appearance, their cartoon version of it, would be altered so it wouldn't be so obvious that it was them. It's pretty simple how it moves along there. He goes and talks to another guy who got rich in Holland selling
falafel.
Or Denmark falafel
for
and
3 years.
And another guy tells a story about how he got separated from his troop and had to hide and swim along the coastline.
One of the things that really hit me is that each of these men at some point do have a disassociation. He would say, well, do you remember if I was there? Or were you in this place? And occasionally the man would just go, maybe. I'm not really sure. There are moments that obviously impacted them that stick out. That man being separated from his regiment, having to hide all night and swim back to his people, and then feeling as though he's an outsider. That was very intense for him. It seemed to circle around to the end that our main character was also in that regiment. He was, like you said, he was with all these people, but they've all sort of forgotten bits. I also couldn't stop thinking about how the friend who sold the falafel, he goes to his house on the advice of his therapist. Ari goes to his therapist and says, I don't know what to do, but I can't really remember these things, and I'm having small flashes. And so he says, well, go talk to the guy you remember in this dream. He has this dream that he's floating in the water, or this memory, that he's floating in water with two other guys, and they're naked and floating, and then they get out of the water and they put their fatigues back on and they walk into the city, and that's all he really remembers.
Yeah, and also he has images of flares.
Yes.
And people being marched out.
He starts remembering more and more as we go. Ari asks him, can I draw pictures of you and your son playing? Because it's snow, it's beautiful. And he says, you can draw as much as you want, but no video.
And I'm also coming into this with this notion that I'm very sympathetic to this Palestinian people. I do see that nation as being an apartheid state. I mean, just straight up. If you disagree with that, I mean, I think I got a lot of history on my side. And if you want to stack the bodies up over since 1947, well, this is something that was pretty infamously investigated at the time. But to look at how things are dealt with now in terms of what the Israeli forces sign off on or do, It seems like there's even less accountability to shit than there even was back then. And this is about a massacre, right? One that everyone acknowledges occurred. As we're getting up to that point, we do get images of them just rolling through, and it is a war, and they do expect to shoot enemy troops. They're soldiers. They have no problem with that. But as they're rolling into Beirut, it makes no bones about it. It's showing civilians getting shot off mules, cars just getting bombed at, and we don't know who's in the car or who's not. We actually don't see very many, except for one flashback story. We really don't see Lebanese counterforces.
They said they're told to just randomly shoot their guns out of their tanks. There is a moment, one of the men tells a story about how the troops were on a boat for a very long time, and he had this vision. He fell asleep. It's our falafel guy. He fell asleep, and he had this vision of this woman coming to save him. It was very much like he needed a mother.
Meghan Trainor is literally mother.
He needed to be taken care of. He had this image of his whole group dying. He wakes up, and they all jump out of this boat, and they swim to shore, and they're all fucking scared. This is their first thing that they're doing. And they just start shooting, and they shoot this car so much that it is ridiculous, and there's no reason. And when they finally stop shooting and go and look, it's just a family. It's just a fucking family
trying to get out of the fucking war zone. The reason why this movie is called Waltz with Bashir is because we get another flashback tale of IDF soldiers going through this area, and they're supposed to be snipers. We don't get good images of them, but it shows that a lot of people in their apartments are just kind of watching these soldiers make their way under sniper fire. And one guy kind of loses his shit a little bit, and the intent is to provide cover for the other guys to move. But he just gets out in the street, and he just starts dancing in circles, just spraying his weapon in the air. And that's why it's called Waltzing with Bashir, because that's what this guy did, because there's images of this guy, Bashir Gemayel.
There's a huge mural of him right behind him.
Who was like a Christian nationalist leader in Lebanon, because it was also under a civil war at the time. And so there were Palestinian forces, PLO, that had sunk ground into Lebanon, and also the Lebanese Shia forces, the Muslim Shia forces. And within Lebanon itself, and this is a big factor into the massacre itself, there was nationalist right-wing Christian forces, and Bashir Gemayel, he got assassinated. Mm-hmm. And that was a big triggering event because of the militia forces under that Christian nationalist wing are the ones who, these Lebanese forces called Philangists, are the ones that executed the thing that Ari Folman is trying to figure out or try to remember once again. And as we get closer to that time, that's when Ari remembers more of what happened. Women and children being marched out by the Philangist forces and being put into trucks. And then he's walking down these areas, and the guy who's telling the story is saying that there were reports by soldiers, IDF soldiers of Phalangists executing whole families. And Ari himself would walk through the aftermath and see bodies piled in the various alleyways throughout this prison camp.
He has the memory of the flares that you mentioned earlier, and he's talking to his therapist at one point, and he says there were all these flares. The flares were shot in the night so that you could see to kill. And I can't remember if he says it or the therapist asks him, but the question is, well, were you shooting flares or people? And he actually said, what is the difference? Because if you're shooting the flares to allow other people to see so that they can shoot the people, you're still shooting the people. It is still on you too. Ari,
as explained, he's like a grunt troop, 19-year-old. You got the area of Sabra and Shatila, and I just so happened... I'm halfway through an audiobook about the history of Israeli intelligence. Oh, wow. It's called Rise and Kill First. I think it's by Ronan Bergman and an Israeli journalist. But I happened to be, the last part I left off there, happened to be about this particular thing. Mm. And the timing of it just kind of is a little kismet. It's quite a good book.
Yeah.
The Sabra and Shatila Massacre, they're two prison camps set up by the IDF. And the IDF, the ranking commanders, they essentially allowed the Phalangists, who had revenge on their fucking mind, to go in and handle. And the accounts here vary. The IDF, they estimated between 300 and 800. There were some accounts that were around 3,000. But I think the biggest consensus is that it cleared 2,000. Now, based upon this movie itself, if you kind of take inventory to what Ari saw, you would say like, oh, well, we got an account of a family being executed. He saw dozens of bodies in alleys. It doesn't really go into how bad that was. Over 2,000 people died, and they let the Phalangists basically run rampant for 2 days, 48 hours. And they would have kept going, but the IDF finally asked them to stop.
Stop the shooting. Stop the shooting immediately. It's an order. Stop the shooting. Immediately. Everybody go home. Go home. Now.
So a little over 2,000 dead is just from 2 full days. And there are accounts of Phalangists before they're going in and talking to IDF soldiers, asking them what they're going to do, and the Phalangists are like, what are we going to do first, rape or kill? I mean, these were a hard right forces. Any commanding officer in the Israeli army knew exactly what these guys are about. They may have been a bit of a secret to a grunt out on the exterior, but one thing that they don't point out here is that there was like about a 5-story office building that loomed over these prison camps, and commanding forces for the IDF actually would meet on the rooftop.
They mentioned it briefly.
And I think in this building, as I understand it, it was more of a commanding officer kind of thing. A lot of decisions were being made there regarding what was going to happen to these people in there. So you could imagine if you're in that building, right? It's 5 stories up, looming just meters. And you got IDF soldiers shooting flares to illuminate so that the Phalangists can see what they're doing when they're just committing horror. Imagine yourself in this building looking down and you see the flares come down, which lights it up like a stadium. There were so many soldiers that probably just stood in that building and could just see the horrors just being taken. See, Ari was in an outer ring, right? He claims he had no idea what the Phalangists were going to do, and he had no idea what was even going on. And I take him at his word for that. They're not going to tell you everything. He's a young guy. He doesn't know much about these dudes. But at the same time, I don't want to undermine the horror that he witnessed and how that affected him. But it's like the people who have the atrocities done against them, they're only bodies here. There's not a voice. They seem to be a tragedy that forces the guy who wasn't even first, like, I don't think he ever said he shot flares or anything, right?
That's the only thing I remember is him saying, what does it matter? He doesn't actually claim any of it. The one thing they do is at the end, once they've been told they have to stop, and in the movie, the last group of women and children that were being told to leave are let go, basically, and they can go back into the camps. This is when they show the alleys that are stacked up as tall as men of just bodies on top of each other and dead people everywhere, children. It's a horror show. They've done so much damage. Buildings are falling apart. And you start hearing the cries of these women, and then it actually shows real footage of these women. And I think that was very important, and I think that was very impactful. And what that said to me is that Ari wanted to make sure that everyone understood that it is real, even if he can't tell the story. I wonder if he feels like he can't tell the story from the other side because, like we were talking about earlier, it's not his experience, right? But it was really real, and it was really raw, and it was really terrible.
You got to give Ari credit for utilizing a language of genocidal behavior on behalf of what the IDF allowed and what they supported here. I think Ari was accused of doing this thing in which was like shooting and then crying, in which you tell the story of where you're an opposing force, and then the story is about how you feel bad about it later. And I do think there's a little bit of that, but I do think he deserves credit for using the language, the very plain language, in dealing with what happened here. And it's even, I mean, if you read on this conflict, it's like, it gets worse. Like we see dead bodies, we see dead children, and it was a tip of the iceberg. Like I said, over 2,000 people died here. And he does correlate, his therapist friend does correlate how the tragedy of what he witnessed as genocidal behavior and how that affects him as someone who is a son of Holocaust survivors. So the movie does make that connection between, instead of, a lot of Israeli apologists will utilize that to justify whatever happens later in time to protect the Israeli state. But Ari does not do that.
The story is told of someone trying to tell a higher officer that people are just being murdered. Like, they don't think that's okay. So a call is made to say, hey, just so you know, these people are just being killed. They're just killing. What's different from the American war movies that we have watched is that in America, the higher ups seem to just blatantly say to you, so that's what happens. It's fucking war. But there seems to be this air of, well, we didn't realize that it was that bad. And when we really realized it, realized it, we told him to stop. Like, when we really understood, but we didn't think it was that bad.
You just described the complete aftermath of the IDF following this massacre, and like and I did get a sense of this. And as far as like how Ari felt about what he saw based on how he was or wasn't involved, I did have a little bit of, like, in terms of his feelings, so fucking what?
Yeah.
I had a little bit of that feeling.
Absolutely.
And the defense minister for Israel at the time, Ariel Sharon was made to step down as he was big on commanding what happened here. But Ariel Sharon, even though he was made to step down as defense minister of Israel, whatever, he would later become fucking prime minister of Israel. This is a pretty good movie. People really fucking went down on this movie a lot when it came out. Like, it won a lot of only very moderate in terms of success in Israel itself. It was a very broadly praised foreign feature across the world.
Did he take shit in Israel?
I don't think so, but
okay.
I know a lot of areas in Lebanon banned the viewing, but some Lebanese groups fought against that, and it was aired in certain places there. Mm-hmm. But I think it just may have been more reacting to the fact that it's an Israeli film. Did you know that Israeli films are made in Palestine? When it comes to information that goes through our media, the reality is that the Palestinian stuff, anything that's going to be sympathetic to the Palestinian people, is often not Western news at all, and is going to be, they'll even change the verbiage depending on Palestinian kid dies in a car by IDF gunfire. It'll be like child found dead in this car without saying like why that kid is dead. Hamas or something shoots up a bunch of Israelis. They're going to be like murdered by Hamas, as it should. It's murder.
But
right?
They should both say murder.
Yeah, it's despicable, the language and the filters that they use here to describe this conflict. But the weird thing is that it's just not, the propaganda isn't as effective anymore in our modern age of technology. It is not hard to see the aftermath of Israeli bombing campaigns in Gaza right now. I've seen far too much footage of dismembered children, destroyed dead infants, being from blown out hospitals. I've seen so much of that. and destroys my soul a little bit every time. And it destroys my soul that I feel like I can do absolutely nothing about it, but sit here and at least be on the side of people who do not have this power, who do not have the power over their own destiny. Before October 7th, they're just in an open air prison where they're only allowed a certain amount of food that can keep them just enough alive. And now it's all under siege. And the Lancet report, which claims that it could clear over 100,000, it's not that surprising, because when a city's under siege, the most vulnerable are children and elderly. They're going to die first.
Yeah.
It is impossible to count all the bodies in real time. There's probably bodies and bodies and bodies that under rubble that they haven't found yet. And over time, as they decompose, it'll be even harder to guess what specific things took their life, except for the horrors of war in general.
Absolutely. You know, we talked about with Grave of the Fireflies that the old and the young folks are also the most susceptible to starvation, to dehydration. These folks already weren't getting enough food.
Ari's reaction back then, being mad about countries that seemed sympathetic to Palestine just days after that attack. I don't know how he feels about it now, but he is mad at Netanyahu, and a lot of people are. But maybe if Ari witnesses any of the destruction of Gaza firsthand, he can forget about it and then make a movie about it later. Waltz with Bashir from 2008, directed by Ari Folman. Very unique film. And I don't think I'm going to go down on it quite as sloppily as a lot of people did at the time. But it is unique enough, and it does tell the story of a massacre very plainly, that in the Western world, we're not going to be privy to a lot of this information. Our media is not going to, it's not invested in us knowing about the Sabra and Shatila massacres. They're just, a lot of people probably learned about, Lebanese right-wing forces and the Phalangists for the first time when they watched this movie. And you got to give it credit for its educational value at the very least, because this is something that everyone should know, especially when our own government is funding this military.
Yeah.
I'm going to give it a 3.5.
I'll match you on that.
Here we go. A respectable B. Anything that's a B and up is a recommend. Yeah. I would recommend this movie just for, it does provide important information. Waltz with Bashir sits below The Watermelon Woman by Cheryl Dunye, which has its own historical place. Waltz with Bashir. If you've never seen it, I definitely do think it's worth it. That said, check the show notes for links, other places to find us. Like, subscribe, leave a comment. Let us know what you think of this movie. Any apartheid defenders, go somewhere else. You got the entire, all of American media on your side, all right? We're just lowly YouTubers. That's all that's really around there to defend people who ain't got shit by people who made sure they ain't got shit. That said, I love you.
I love you.
Let's get out of here.
Do I say it for this one too? Feels weird.
Just be consistent.
Let's hear it for the boys.
The Philangist?
Oh!